We have a simple message for all countries: test, test, test.
A simple message, yes. A simple solution, we're not sure. And certainly not all countries have been employing it. The fight against coronavirus has multiple fronts: testing, tracing infection chains, racing to create vaccines and treatments, or seeing what already exists and what could be adapted to treat the novel coronavirus. How should countries prioritize? I'm Janelle Dumalaon, and those are the kinds of questions we want to answer in this DW COVID-19 special. It's the same one scientists and government officials have grappled with since the beginning of the outbreak. Now back to the message to test, test, and test. South Korea was one of the countries which followed the World Health Organization's advice most diligently and managed to flatten the curve. Here's how South Korea did it.
A South Korean hospital has created a new system for testing patients suspected of suffering from the coronavirus COVID-19. After an initial consultation, patients enter a booth to have samples taken and talk to a medical technician using an intercom. Song Young-hyun had developed a fever and other cold-like symptoms and decided to get a test just to be safe.
If you don't know that you have it, the pandemic spreads. Even if you're a little anxious, it's good to have a test. At first, I was scared when I heard about it, but it wasn't as painful as I thought, and it was actually kind of interesting.
The booths are the brainchild of Dr. Kim Sang-il. Early designs were quickly put in service on March 10th. The booths help medical workers process patients 10 times faster than the traditional procedure.
Prior to the introduction of this system, patients were treated in large negative pressure rooms, which take a long time to sterilise and ventilate. It's inefficient, and doctors and nurses had to meet people face to face and were nervous about exposure and tired. This physical separation is safer and enables prompt examinations.
Dozens of hospitals in South Korea and abroad have expressed interest in implementing a booth testing system. Although these prototypes are not scaled for manufacturing, Dr. Kim has shared his know-how. Testing has been a key pillar to South Korea's response to the coronavirus outbreak, seeking to flatten the curve and reduce the number of new cases without implementing a complete lockdown. Test kits manufactured here have been exported to other countries to strengthen their response to the pandemic. Drive-through testing has also been an innovative way South Korea has battled the coronavirus outbreak. Despite fewer coronavirus cases in South Korea in recent days, medical intern Park Chan-soo argues for rapid testing.
The number of confirmed persons is gradually decreasing. The most important thing to get rid of the epidemic is to identify the suspected patients as soon as possible and have them self-isolate or receive necessary treatment. If you have even a little fever or suspected symptoms, it's recommended that you go to the hospital and get tested.
After examining thousands of patients, drive-through and booth testing have only uncovered a few cases of the coronavirus. But they have offered a lot of reassurance to a nervous population.
Joining me now is Al Edwards. He is a professor and immunologist at the University of Reading in the UK. Welcome, Al. Now, South Korea's method seems to be working. So why aren't all affected countries doing mass testing if they can?
It's a really good question. I think that the video you just saw gives you some glimpses as to why. Testing itself is a very valuable tool, but it's quite labour intensive and it has to be done really carefully, because if you do testing in a way that isn't properly and safely controlled, there is a risk that you can also spread the virus or put your health workers at risk when they take those samples. So it's a delicate balance and it needs a lot of manpower.
Well, because of the complexity of this task, we can imagine that not all countries are able to enroll this kind of mass testing. What would you recommend for those countries?
So I think that the most important thing is to spread the resource you have wisely. So what's really important is to, first of all, prioritize people who are in hospital and also healthcare workers, because these are the most vulnerable people and also the most exposed people. And by prioritizing the use of your testing resource and by using that as smartly as possible, even if you have limited testing resource, it's still incredibly valuable, and it gives you so much data and so much information about what's going on.
What about home testing kits? Could they help at all?
Yeah, so there's a number of different technologies and tools out there. These can even be as simple, I have one here of this little plastic cassette that could potentially be used at home. This kind of technology is going to be incredibly useful, but it does have to be used very carefully. So when you do a lab test, you have the best possible accuracy. If you do a home test, they're not quite as accurate, but they're more convenient. So you have to make sure that you use the best possible science and medical practice to use these tests effectively, rather than just using them without proper consideration.
Now, testing is, of course, one issue, but how much of an issue is, for example, global access to vaccines and treatments going to be? Are we in danger of seeing a first-come, first-served approach which could prioritize rich countries, for example?
Yeah, and I think that's already happening to a degree with testing even. The better off countries are getting first access to testing technology. And unfortunately, I can see the same thing happen with therapies. There's some really good news and some positive news, which is that people seem to be incredibly open to sharing the information they have about improved treatments, and that's vital. So everybody has that knowledge, but whether we can see the same sharing of resources, I'm not so sure about. Whether that's resource in terms of ventilators or when vaccines start to be manufactured, whether people will share them around, I'm not sure whether that's going to happen. We'll have to see.
Information sharing as well as resource sharing. It's going to be vital. Thank you very much, Al Edwards. He is a professor and immunologist at the University of Reading in the UK. Thanks for your insights. Now, vaccines seem to interest many of you as you've been sending us your questions in the last few days. Our science correspondent, Derek Williams, has some answers for you. Take a look.
The problem with developing any pharmaceutical product is that it has to go through an exhaustive testing process. With the vaccine, you first have to identify good potential candidates, and that went astonishingly quickly this time. Within weeks of identifying the virus and sequencing its genome, researchers began talking about candidates, but that's just the start. You next have to test your candidate for safety. Usually you do it first in animals and then in increasingly large groups of humans. But only after a candidate has proven safe do developers usually begin looking at actually how effective it is. And even if and when your candidate fulfills all of those criteria, you still have to ramp up production to manufacture hundreds of millions or even billions of doses. Now, there are ways to speed the entire process up a little bit, for example, by running some of those trials in parallel rather than one after the other, but that approach has drawbacks too, and that's why most experts usually predict that we won't have a vaccine ready to distribute on a wide scale for at least a year and a half. Medications are, of course, important for limiting the impact of the virus on patients around the world, but long-term, to defeat the disease, we need what's called herd immunity, and the best way to get that is through vaccines. If we don't develop vaccines, experts currently estimate that between 50 and 70% of us would have to get COVID-19 before herd immunity kicked in and stopped the pandemic naturally. But along the way, it could potentially kill millions of people. So a vaccine offers a safe alternative to achieving immunity in a large percentage of the population. An ounce of prevention is really worth a pound of cure. That's why, although treatments are very important, long-term, vaccines are even more so. A range of potential drugs that might one day help treat COVID-19 are being trialed around the world, but we don't really have many results for any of them so far. The World Health Organization is looking at 3 candidates in particular that have shown some promise. First, it's examining the effects of established anti-malarial drugs on coronavirus symptoms. WHO-sponsored trials are also ongoing for combinations of antivirals that have already been approved for treating HIV. And finally, one of the most promising substances is a compound called remdesivir. It was originally developed as a potential treatment for Ebola, but it didn't work out for that disease as well as hoped. Retrospective testing, however, showed that it did affect replication in the SARS virus, so hopes are high that it might also affect that pathogen's close relative, the new coronavirus. The best thing about all of these candidates is that most or all of the development has already been done for them, so production could be ramped up quickly if they did prove effective in these clinical trials. We should know soon if any of them work.
And before we let you go, we step away from the sobering world of tests and vaccines to indulge in lighter fare. One restaurant in Hanoi has created the Corona Burger, so far only available in Vietnam, but it looks set to take off worldwide. It's a beef burger in a green tea-stained virus-shaped bun. The restaurant owner is delighted with his creation. He says business is good, and they'll hopefully remind customers to wash their hands before eating. And there are Swiss confectioners reminding us of the season, but also of the times, with chocolate Easter bunnies decorated with little face masks.